The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com. Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the New Books in Economic and Business History, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Ghassan Moazin, one of the hosts of the channel. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Austin Dean, who is assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and we will talk to him about his recent book, China and the End of Global Silver, 1873 to 1937, which came out with Cornell University Press in 2020, and is a wonderful study of Chinese monetary reform during the late 19th and first half of the 20th century that not only sheds new light on modern Chinese history, but also provides many new insights for historians of global history and U.S. history. So Austin, thanks so much for taking the time, and welcome to the New Books Network.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
So Austin, as always, I thought before we really delve into the book, whether we could start by you just talking a bit about how you got into the study of modern China and also into this particular topic that you chose to work on.
Right, I think that's a complicated question, and I'll try to be brief. And I think I don't have any particularly interesting origin story as far as how I got interested in Chinese history. Just taking a class when I was in college. I was a history major, and I had been exposed to some Chinese history in high school through world history or those kind of big survey classes, but just got very, very interested in it. And where I went to college was a small school in Iowa called Grinnell College. And when I was finishing up, Grinnell, since the 1980s, had this exchange program with Nanjing University to kind of select 2 graduating students to go over to Nanjing. And I was very fortunate to get one of those kind of postgraduate scholarships, and actually spent 2 years in Nanjing and just kind of thought, I want to keep learning more about China. And I think that experience really solidified my kind of plans to go to graduate school. And then I think as far as the topic, I think everyone has a circuitous path in one way or another, and something that gets kind of refined over time. But I think perhaps maybe the moment of inspiration was at one point I was kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do, and I was reading Frank H. King, not one of his books on the HSBC banks, but the monetary history book that's from like 1964, and there was one line about the United States making a silver coin to kind of use in the China market. And it was kind of this one throwaway line that I thought, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. I want to learn more about that. And slowly over time, that kind of turned into the book after kind of lots of, changing of my mind and frustrations and back and forth. But I think, yeah, that's kind of perhaps the simplest and most direct kind of origin story for my own kind of interest in Chinese studies, which just kind of started in college and then for the topic itself.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it sounds interesting and certainly familiar. I think, it's really sometimes difficult to sort of pinpoint exactly or have this kind of straight line to the topic, but it can be rather, random things that one reads. I can certainly, and that gets interested, I can certainly say sort of similar things about myself. So to turn to your fascinating book now, obviously, it's all about silver, and the role that China sort of played in bringing to an end the role of silver as sort of an important currency in the world economy. But as I think that I think historians of China are rather familiar with silver as a currency and its importance in the Chinese economy. But I think for everyone else, I wonder whether you could start a bit by discussing, your book sort of starts off in the 1870s, but just talking a bit about the role of silver as a currency in the world economy, but also in the Chinese economy before the 1870s.
Right, and I think this is a really important point to kind of start out with, that when we think of silver today, if we think about it at all, if you ever watch Bloomberg or CNBC late at night, they'll have like the rare silver coins, right, that are trying to be sold to people, or on the History Channel. And I think we only think of it as a curiosity. And I think a lot of what the book is trying to do is to recreate this kind of intellectual, material world where kind of silver and its role in the global economy is incredibly important. And I think it's something that starts in the 1500s with kind of the discovery of silver mines in Potosi in Latin America, and kind of silver binding together China, Europe, Latin America, later the United States, and kind of serving as a medium of exchange globally, and then also within the Chinese economy as well, having this most kind of dual circulation currency system with copper coins minted by the state, and then silver provided by the market that comes in various forms through Spanish silver dollars, Mexican silver dollars, U.S. silver dollars, and kind of on throughout 1700s and 1800s. And so I think that is kind of strange for us to think about. And I think one reason, and this is something I talk about in the introduction of the book, is that I think there's a lot of focus on the creation of the gold standard, right? How did it work? Why does it spread to where it spread? Why do countries adopt the gold standard in this period of like the high gold standard from, say, 1880 or so through the First World War, and kind of obscures the issue of silver, which was still very important in China and in lots of other places around the world, Mexico and the United States as well. So very much an important global issue that people all around the world were thinking about in very concrete and serious ways kind of throughout this period in the late 19th century, as kind of the price of silver for the first time starts to decline.
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly your point that there's so much, I think, emphasis always on the gold standard in the late 19th century, and there's like tons of literature that you can read about that. But I guess especially coming from a Chinese perspective, that's kind of it's surprising that there's so little on silver, because if I read reports on certainly the China trade at that time, finance between China and Europe, the silver price is always, that's such an important element in all of that, and how silver is doing. I think one thing we should touch upon, and you've already sort of started off on that, but we should probably really explain that as you say, in China, there was kind of, you had copper coins that were used and minted by the government. And then the silver sort of was not really under government control. And I wonder whether you could talk a bit more about that, but also, I don't want to get into too much sort of technicalities, but I think we should probably explain this whole idea, especially because you just mentioned Frank King's book. That was one of the first places I learned about this, about the tail as sort of this empty ghost unit of currency in China that existed, and the actual money that was the silver money that was actually used, and how these two relate to each other. So I wonder whether you could talk briefly about that.
Yeah, this is. We could talk a long time about this. I'll try to be quite short. At kind of the simplest level, you had, we'll say, copper coins with kind of holes in the middle of them so they could be strung together, that were made by various provincial mints. And those served, again, in general, in kind of local level trade, regional trade, where silver, which again was provided by international trade in the market, was sometimes in ingots or chunks, or sometimes in silver coins of Mexican silver dollars or US silver dollars. And then there were these kind of abstract units of account known as taels. And there wasn't just one or two, there were a lot that depended on kind of where you were. There was a Shanghai commercial tael. In most kind of major trading ports and market towns had kind of their own commercial unit of account, which is kind of an abstraction, right? And then the kind of the rule of thumb was that a Mexican silver coin, for example, could satisfy like 0.72 of a tael unit of account in Shanghai, but that could differ in the time of the year, kind of the supply and demand of money. And then also the ratio between copper and silver coins could also change a lot depending on numerous factors that can change over the course of the year, and then also many years as well. So I think that's kind of one, I think, perhaps a barrier to try to wrap your head around, because it seems at the outset quite unfamiliar. But then I think, as you mentioned, when you're reading, especially merchant magazines, one source I looked a lot into was the American Asiatic Association, and kind of this network of traders who are very concerned about all of these issues. And kind of to get your kind of head around it, you need to spend a little time. And I think that's why the first chapter of the book is just kind of laying this all out, right? It's quite short, because in my mind, I want it to appeal to people beyond the field of modern Chinese history who probably don't know the ins and outs of all of this, and just to kind of set the scene, nothing quite too long, not too much detail, but just to try to get everyone on the same page before going forward.
Yeah, no, wonderful. I think that was a wonderful explanation, I think, of the different units. But I mean, I also should say that the first chapter in your book really is a really good overview, and I would think primer on the sort of Qing monetary system that really sets things up quite well for the rest of the book. I thought so to delve in then into I think into that first chapter. I think one point that I wonder whether you could talk a bit more about is that, of course, you give sort of an overview, but you also start talking already in chapter 1 a bit about certain Chinese officials sort of from the mid 19th century getting a bit concerned about the Chinese monetary system and thinking about possible ways of reforming it, that things should be changed. So I wonder whether you could talk a bit more about, why the Chinese officials we have this monetary system that you so nicely described with copper and silver, but in the 19th century, why did some Chinese officials think that maybe there needed to be some kind of change?
Yeah, and I think this is really important background. In here, if people listening to this haven't read the book China Upside Down by Lin Man Hong, I really recommend that book, which is in some ways kind of a prequel to my book, looking at especially the kind of what we might call kind of the currency crisis of the 1820s, 1830s, when kind of the silver and copper ratio gets quite disjointed or moved very far away from the historical average. And there's lots of people starting to think about the role of silver in the Chinese economy, whether it brings more harms than benefits, and then also thinking about how that should change, right? And I think that's another book that quite influenced my own thinking. And one goal for me in writing my own book and thinking about China Upside Down, which I enjoyed a lot and took a lot from, is that I wanted to bring more of the international angle into the center stage, and have people from Mexico, people from the United States as kind of more characters in it. So I think that's kind of this key event in the 1820s, 1830s, generally known as like the Daoguang Depression, and kind of the kind of unprecedented relationship between copper coins and silver, and kind of that spurring an initial wave of thinking about, how does and should the monetary system of China interact with the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I don't know, I think we should highlight again what kind of I think from our perspective now, it's sort of really strange to think about, having a country where silver is so important, but actually the state doesn't really have any control over it. It's sort of foreign currency flowing in. And I think, the officials have to try, sort of, as this ratio between copper and silver gets out of whack, they sort of start thinking then, what are we going to do about this, and is it actually beneficial? But I really also take your point, and I think this is really one of the things I really admire and like most about your book, is that you really bring in this global international perspective. So it is not just a story about China from sort of this, China-centered, China-focused perspective, but rather you really bring in the global dimension to all of this. And particularly the United States, of course, plays a role. And so, I think in the book we can see that sort of in chapters 2 and chapter 3, you sort of, I think you even say it like that, you bring the two strands sort of, you set up sort of the two strands of your narrative. And then chapter 2 first, and chapter 3 looks at China, of course, but chapter 2 looks at the United States. And tells this, I think, really interesting story about the U.S. trade dollar. And I think that was what you were sort of referring to in the Frank King book as well. So I wonder whether you could talk a bit more about, the global context that you bring in chapter 2, but in particular the story of the trade dollar, because I think it's a fascinating story that is really not known well enough by people.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad that because that story was kind of the impetus of the whole project, that it plays the role of kind of the launching off chapter after the introduction. And I think this is one area where I really, and hopefully also contributing something to U.S. history, where kind of the two angles I set up is kind of the international angle, places like the United States, Great Britain, Japan, wanting to have more of a role, perhaps influencing Chinese monetary system or having control over the Chinese monetary system, versus kind of internal efforts within China, thinking about how the currency system should change. And I think that first chapter is kind of setting up this story of the United States creating this coin to try to use in the China market to replace the Mexican silver dollar as the coin of choice. And it's also kind of very much in the context of American political economy at the time, where the same kind of act, the Coinage Act of 1873, that creates the trade dollar, also, several years later become known as the crime of 73 for kind of taking the U.S. off of bimetallism, putting it on gold standard, and plays a huge role in the discourse of late 19th century U.S. kind of domestic politics. And I'm trying to hopefully add something to that by talking about the story of the trade dollar and how it kind of has, in some ways, is unsuccessful, right? It doesn't take hold really in the China market. A lot of these coins are still circulating in the United States, which causes its own kind of set of problems. And I think it also shows what we might call kind of the arrogance of the United States, where all the people advocating for this measure say that it will work wonderfully. And then several years later, you have all these consular reports coming in from American consular officials throughout China saying, well, we have never seen a trade dollar here, and we doubt it will ever take hold. And I think that we see a similar attitude kind of throughout the rest of the story with kind of American officials and perhaps Japanese officials and British officials kind of overestimating their ability to kind of influence these things. But I think it particularly stands out in the U.S. case, and the trade dollar is kind of an interesting origin story of that to kind of offer a simple solution and completely overestimate the expected results.
Yeah, I mean, you already, it really is a fascinating story. But I want to, I mean, you already said that it failed and it kind of didn't work out as I guess people in the US had hoped. But do we actually, I mean, could you talk a bit about like why it didn't work out, but also what the response in China was? I mean, was that received at all? Were people just, not caring about it all? Or was
I think that it does take hold a bit in the kind of areas around Hong Kong, into Fujian, Xiamen, and other places. However, it is traded at a discount to the Mexican silver dollar. And then also there were some complaints that it was kind of too heavy and too fine a coin, so it would be melted down for its bullion as well. So I think there are multiple kind of factors at play. And then especially in kind of the northern areas of the country, where silver did not circulate, northern and central areas of the country, where again, in general, silver didn't circulate as much as on kind of, we'll say, the south and southeast coast. These are all factors. And various kind of U.S. Consular officials try to say that they will only conduct business using U.S. trade dollars, but that's not a tenable position, and try to get merchants to stop putting kind of chop marks on the coin, kind of these symbols to attest to kind of that the coin is not counterfeit, that merchants kind of had their own chop marks that they would use. And that effort also kind of comes to naught. So I think there are various factors about kind of the coin itself, the existing situation in various cities, and kind of existing practices as well.
Yeah, and I think it generally also speaks to the fact how difficult it is to sort of bring in a new currency and try to replace a sort of something like the Mexican dollar, for example, had been used for so long.
And I think inertia is a powerful force, especially in kind of the matters such as these.
Sure, yes, and then the whole experiment is also sort of aborted relatively quickly. By the end of the 1880s, it's sort of, as you explain, it sort of it comes to an end. But certainly we can sort of see then, I think from chapter 2 in your book, that the US is people in the US are aware of the sort of the monetary system in China, of course, and they try to have some kind of impact on it. And I think that sort of sets up the story that will follow in the chapters thereafter in the US role quite nicely. But then in chapter 3, of course, you do return to China, and I think it's a sort of a wonderful discussion of particularly the self-strengthening movement. So this movement for trying to modernize China from the 1860s to the 1890s, roughly, by certain reformers, and the sort of the role that monetary reform, which I think is really sort of within the self-strengthening movement, we're always talking about military reform and things like that, but not much on sort of what the monetary side of this is. And I think that is really something that you bring up really nicely in chapter 3. So I wonder whether you could sort of talk a bit more about, within the self-strengthening movement, this effort to sort of modernize China, what monetary reform, what role it actually plays in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I really agree about kind of the position of the self-strengthening movement. And then also, I think we have this story of, importing machines, trying to build arsenals, and we focus a lot on shipbuilding and other types of kind of areas, but there was also machines to make money, right? And so I think that initial kind of story is looking at, in my mind, kind of trying to reform or change the existing kind of monetary arrangements as is by the government essentially starting to mint its own silver coins, which it had not really done before, right? And the impetus, like a lot of the other movements in the self-strengthening kind of era, often start from provincial officials, right? Li Hongzhang, Zhang Zhedong, and others. And they are kind of the lead forces who say that, why are we using foreign money, right? This is a loss to us. We should import this equipment, establish kind of new mints to make silver, and have our own kind of coins, right? And in my mind, this is kind of a big change, right? Not as much as some of the reform proposals as later, but still quite significant. And I think that it starts out, and because it's advocated for by provincial officials are the ones who are overseeing it. And that also in some ways leads to some of the problems, right? Where the coins would have kind of on them themselves would have kind of the province they were minted in, right? And there were lots of worries about uniformity, right, among the different provinces. And you see quite interestingly that, there would be a discount in exchange from a silver coin from Guangzhou or wherever it might be. If it got to the Nanjing area, right, that would not be taken, or there would be a discount, right? You would get a haircut if you wanted to change to copper or kind of do any other financial transactions, right? And so I think kind of the impetus of the kind of this desire of provincial officials to mint money also kind of foreshadows the problems and its eventual downfall. And we do see kind of a movement in kind of 1898, the 100 Days Reform period in the Guangxu Emperor, to kind of centralize some of this, shut down several mints, right? But again, provincial officials are able to kind of lobby their case about why their mint should stay open, right? And I think we see it's kind of in a way, a microcosm of important issues in the political economy of the self-strengthening period, where you have so much kind of the initial movement happening from provincial officials, but that also creates lots of other problems in terms of trying to have standardization or unification or things like that.
Yeah. Again, I think the way you really explain that in the book is wonderfully done and really, really interesting. I think it's also, just to sort of draw that out a bit more, this sort of dynamic that you talk about between provincial attempts to sort of bring about monetary reform and then the central government, that is sort of obviously a dynamic, again, that we see often when we discuss the self-strengthening movement, but not really from the monetary side. What I also wonder whether, as I found very interesting, is of course that this also has larger implications of sort of the relation between the Qing government and the economy. And I wonder, whether so what your thoughts on that are, because I think we can see there's a change of, I suppose one could say, more intervention by the central, by government, be that provincial governments or the central government in the economy, that we really haven't seen so far.
Right. No, and I think we see this across the self-strengthening movement with various types of companies being formed, banks, and here I think I would definitely point readers to the book by Stephen Halsey, Quest for Power, kind of Qing statecraft in the late 19th century. And I believe Tai-Su Zhang of Yale University will have a new book out soon about kind of shifts in the Qing fiscal state, kind of at this period of, we might, again, depending on the word you want to choose, activism or intervention. I think we see this in lots of areas with trying to win back tariff reform, tariff autonomy, as Philip Tai has studied. So yeah, I think this is, especially in the 1870s, 1880s going forward, we do see, I think, important shifts in terms of, again, what we might call activism or intervention or state building or state capacity, depending on how you want, what definition and term you want to latch on to.
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I think that is something that also comes out when you've kindly mentioned all these other works, but it really comes out of your book, I think, very nicely as well. All right, and so I think in chapters 2 and 3, you sort of set the U.S. side of the story and the Chinese side of the story up really nicely, but they then sort of come together in chapter 4, and I think that's a really fascinating read as well. I think sort of the two aspects that I found probably most interesting in chapter 4 are, first, of course, the Boxer indemnity, which I think again is not primarily thought of in terms of currency reform, but it's actually, there's sort of a very important seed that is put in there. And I think the other side of the story is this American Commission, Jeremiah Jenkins, and so on. But I think first we can probably start off. Of course, there was sort of the Boxer Rebellion, 1899, 1900, and then you have a foreign intervention, and then there's this big indemnity that China has to pay to these foreign powers. But I wonder whether you could talk about a bit about, what was the role of the Boxer indemnity in actually furthering currency reform and also foreign involvement in Chinese currency reform.
Right. So I think, this is really important, where I think the Boxer Rebellion is obviously a huge topic in Chinese history, but I think the kind of initial aftermath of the first couple of years after the Boxer Protocol is signed maybe doesn't get as much attention, particularly in terms of how the indemnity is going to be paid. And is the indemnity denominated in gold, or is it denominated in silver? And kind of controversies about that. And again, to kind of simplify, there's this controversy that evolves where some people in the Qing dynasty argue that the indemnity is not a debt in gold, it's a debt in silver, right? What happens over the first couple of years is that in order to procure the gold on the international market that the Qing needs to satisfy the indemnity, they have to sell a lot of silver on the market. And in especially 1901, 1902, we see a kind of further, pretty acute drop in the price of silver in relation to gold. And if that continued, and if the Boxer indemnity was a debt in gold, it would get harder and harder for the Qing to pay off that debt, as kind of the ability of silver to procure gold continued to plummet, right? So within, again, provincial officials in the Qing at the time start to argue that, well, if you really look at the actual Boxer Protocol, right, and the list of payments, it just listed in tails, right? So they argue that, it's a debt in silver. The Inspectorate of the Maritime Customs, Sir Robert Hart, who's very involved in all of these, basically says, no, you're wrong. And all of the other diplomats say, no, we don't agree. But eventually the Qing, again, more or less stopped paying, right, in gold. And this is in some ways one of the origins of this American Commission that is kind of a joint commission that initially Mexico, under Porfirio Diaz and the finance minister in Mexico, Jose Lee Montour, kind of call jointly Mexico and the Qing call on the United States to try to do something about the price of silver. And the U.S. is very involved in this because the U.S. is also a major producer of silver, mostly in Nevada, where I'm from. So I think that's kind of the U.S. connection. And the U.S. sees this as a way to increase its kind of power in the global financial system, and also as a lead in to kind of grow the trade with China, right? So I think the U.S. has multiple motivations under the Secretary of State John Hay at the time, and it's in a lot of ways it's a very strange story where this group of Americans first go to Mexico, then they go to Europe, and then because they don't have enough money, they only send one member of the commission to China, this guy Jeremiah Jenks, who was a Cornell University professor, and he meets with everybody, right? He has an imperial audience, he tours the country, he meets with Zhang Zhedong, he meets with lots of officials, and the chapter is kind of discussing about how does the Qing government and observers kind of understand what this gold exchange standard proposal would mean. And whether or not they could and should adopt it, right? And again, in some ways, it's perhaps a story of failure, because the Qing obviously does not adopt the gold exchange standard. But I think I interpret it not so much as a failure, but in a lot of ways setting the terms of the big intellectual, political, and economic issues for the next 35 years or so. Where, in contrast to Chapter 3, which is all about minting silver coins, right? This is a much different intellectual world, right? In terms of trying to establish a gold exchange standard. And so I think that is the kind of this turning point in where kind of the international and the domestic threads really come together in this period around, 1903, 1904, 1905. And in a lot of ways, the next 30 years are talking about the gold exchange standard, the gold standard, the silver standard, or just paper currency itself, right? To kind of completely get off any kind of metallic backing to the currency system.
Yeah, and I think this, the sort of Zheng's kind of journey throughout China and all these meetings, I think that comes out sort of a really rich sort of description in your book. But because you say that in the end, of course, China does not adopt the gold standard, and one could, I guess, say that again, obviously, it depends on how you interpret it, but why do you think that they, in the end, all these important people met with Zheng and so on, but why was it in the end not really a success story, in the sense of at least getting China to really change its monetary system and adopt the gold standard?
Yeah, and I think, like any question, that's probably several factors at work. I think the main stated reason by Zhang Zedong and others is that this would be giving foreigners, in some ways, too much control. That one of Zheng's proposals is that there would be kind of certain foreign experts to come in to set up the system and kind of administer it, and as well as there would have to be a loan taken out to kind of provide the funds to make the initial shift, which would be on perhaps onerous and unfavorable terms. And I think another reason that I don't flesh out as much in the book, but I kind of, another interpretation is that it would take quite a lot of power away from provincial officials, right? Again, thinking about kind of the contours of the political economy in the 1890s, early 1900s, that mints were under the control of provincial officials, right? And well, in theory, they have to report everything back to the Board of Revenue, later the Ministry of Finance, that, there was plenty of room for other kind of action. So I think a truly standardized gold exchange standard would have really taken a lot of authority away from people like Zhang Zedong, who in his memorials, he writes 2 memorials to the central government about his meeting with Zheng. He doesn't really mention that, but again, that's kind of just a suspicion I have thinking about kind of the broader relationship between the kind of provincial and central government in terms of, again, this kind of push and pull and tug of war of power.
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely, I think, concur with that, because I think a lot of reform efforts generally during that period that we see, they often, I think, run into this problem that, greater centralization means less power for all these strong provincial governors like Zhang Zedong, for example, and they are not necessarily, they're probably not going to say it openly, but they're not that happy to actually give in. And especially in public finance, of course, by that time, the early 20th century, there's a lot of leeway that the provinces have, and they certainly don't, they don't report everything to Beijing quite clearly. But because you just mentioned, the one of the problems with that with the proposal was that the Qing didn't want to take on a foreign loan for this purpose. But a few years later, then, as you sort of to move to chapter 5, you actually do discuss a loan that is taken out, or well, almost, I guess, but at least it's concluded. The currency reform and development loan that is signed with a consortium of foreign banks that is supposed to actually help with currency reform. But then, timing-wise, it's probably the worst timing possible because, of course, in 1911, then the Qing falls and you have the 1911 revolution, and it never really gets anywhere. But in terms of at least, properly floating the loan and actually doing what was set out. But still, I think, out of what you describe in terms of the negotiations for the currency reform loan and what it was supposed to do, it tells us a lot about foreign involvement again in Chinese currency reform. So I wonder whether you could talk a bit more, like what was this loan, why was it actually signed, and why did it not, in the end, come to fruition?
Right. So yeah, Hank, I agree that this is a fascinating kind of area and gets very close to a lot of your own research as well. And I think for me, to maybe zoom out a little bit, I think in this chapter and the next chapter, I spent a lot of time thinking about having some type of narrative vehicle to get through the chapters, because it's covering the late Qing into the early Republic, right? There's lots of things going on. How can I provide continuity? And I decided that the story of this loan does a good job because it takes you kind of from like 1909 or so through the early 1920s. And to kind of, again, simplify it, these banking consortiums emerged in kind of this period, groups of banks from different countries coming together to loan money to the Qing dynasty. And the Americans tried to kind of elbow their way in. And there's a number of loans that are talked about. Kind of the other very famous one that's signed with it at the same time as the loan of this book that I study in the book is the Huguang Railway loan, which a lot of people point to as a factor leading to perhaps, the kind of quick downfall of the Qing. And the currency reform and development loan is this loan that's originally agreed to provide funds to unify the currency system on the silver standard, right? And it's signed and agreed to. And the question, though, is, it goes back to this authority, right? How much role do these foreign bankers have on signing off on the Qing currency proposals, right? During the negotiations, there's, saying, oh, well, the foreign bankers want 9 months to review it. And the Qing say, well, we've had these regulations out for a year. Why haven't you looked at them already? So there's all this kind of delay and back and forth in kind of positioning for leverage. And right when the bankers approve the loan in a month later, approved to say that they're going to float the loan within 6 months' times, within 4 weeks, kind of the Wuhan uprising breaks out, and then a couple months later, the Qing dynasty no longer exists. And so then kind of the rest of the chapter is negotiations about the loan, whether to continue it, and then also how it relates to other really important loans at this time, the reorganization loan. You have a lot of action where the United States, when President Woodrow Wilson comes into office, they leave this banking consortium, and then 3 years later they come back. And then at the same time, Japan is trying to kind of take advantage of the situation through kind of this figure, Nishihara, who is also trying to kind of get Chinese currency reform to happen under the guidance or control of Japan. And it becomes this kind of, even though the loan never gets made, it becomes every seemingly 6 months or so, there's this kind of crisis in all these capitals around the world. What are we going to do? Because the Qing dynasty agreed to this term in the original contract that it can extend the period when bankers have to make the loan in 6 months increments. So initially the Republican government extends it no problem, but then by 1915, 1916, it becomes much more contentious, and it becomes this very thorny issue between the United States, Japan, Great Britain, and the various kind of governments in this period of the 1910s. And it's quite interesting that, even at the Versailles Peace Conference, right, there are discussions about this consortium. And it appears everywhere, this consortium in this currency and development loan. And I think it speaks to what I call the intensification of this issue, right? Of kind of especially the imperial, what we call the imperial ambition of different countries to play what they would call the leading role in shepherding Chinese currency reform that we see from the U.S. angle, and I think we especially see from the Japanese government at the time, just a year and a half or so after the 21 demands, you have the kind of various Nishihara loans that cause further kind of issues in capitals around the world.
Yeah, and I think as you say, sort of what is really, I think what the chapter really, and these sort of how you trace the story of this loan really brings out nicely is what important that people in Western foreign high politics really were very concerned with this whole Chinese currency question, and as you say, who gets to play a leading role in all of this, what foreign power. All of that is really, plays an important part again, in which I don't think many people know about or pay attention to when you read sort of accounts, for example, of as you say, the Versailles Peace Conference, for example. That's not something Chinese currency is probably not something that we immediately think about, but it really is quite a significant topic. And I think again, this the chapter really brings that out nicely. And I think then, nevertheless, sort of when we move to chapter 6, I think we then sort of come more to sort of bring this more to the on the ground level. There's this wonderful case, of the new mint that is set up in Shanghai, the Shanghai Mint, and you sort of look at the role that the mint plays, sort of in the 1920s and 1930s, and trying to again do currency reform in China, but this time, of course, as we said, there was not really a silver standard in China. It was sort of all kinds of different units of currency, and in chapter 6, we look at how the Shanghai Mint is used to try and bring about a unitary silver standard. And I think it's really nice that use this particular case and really show the sort of technicalities of all of this and the role. And sort of in order to show sort of the larger efforts of bringing about a unitary silver standard. So I wonder whether you can talk a bit more about, what was the idea behind this mint, and what was the role in bringing about a silver standard, and also why were people, interested in actually having one unitary silver standard?
Yeah, so I think this is, again, in my mind, the mint was kind of the narrative vehicle to wrap a lot of changes around, because this is the period when we see the nationalist government consolidate power in 27, 28. We see kind of the initial stages of the Great Depression, right? We see further drop in kind of the price of silver on the world market, and kind of using the mint as a lens to kind of tie all these things together was in my mind how I wanted to kind of structure the chapter. And I think that the idea of the people at the time who were kind of the force behind the mint in the early 1920s, and especially later in the latter period of the 1920s, when it actually becomes known as the central mint, is that, like, because the Shanghai tale was so important, right, that if you can have a standard unit of currency or coin in Shanghai, because Shanghai has so much what we might call market power or market influence, that will impact other places, right? And kind of help standardize and kind of further kind of make tail units of account unnecessary. And so that's kind of the initial impetus of that in the early 1920s. And then as in 1923, 24, 25, the kind of Chinese politics gets very not sure what adjective to use to complicate it. You see ministers of finance coming and going quite quickly. Like all the mint, like they build a floor of it, right? And they don't really get up and running. They run out of money, and there's no more money. But then when the nationalists come into power, they kind of revamp the mint. They finish building it. You can actually still go there in Shanghai. The mint is still there. And they bring back kind of the foreign technical expert, an American guy named Clifford Hewitt, who had been running the mint in the Philippines. And then at the same time, when the mint gets going in kind of 27, 28, there's again this big discussion about, well, what kind of currency system do we want? Like, should we try to go on the gold exchange standard? Should we stick to silver, right? And we have this kind of similar debate again, but it plays out now in the context of the initial period of the Great Depression, right? Where there is another kind of U.S. mission by a Princeton professor, Edwin Kemmerer, who goes and tries to give the nationalist government financial advice on a whole host of issues, the currency being one of them. And he recommends the gold exchange standard. And this is an interesting quirk that all the machinery that was on in the mint in 1929, 1930 was all for minting kind of old style silver dollars, right? So if they did that, if the government wanted to go on the gold exchange standard, they would need new dies and things like that. Dies are kind of the thing that makes the imprint on the coin. So it's a very kind of fraught process, and eventually they kind of the nationalist government and especially the Minister of Finance, Song Ziwen or TV Song, decides to go to kind of try to unify on the silver standard, because in the midst of the Great Depression, when countries are going off the gold standard, especially in kind of 1931, it's not a good time at all to try to go on the gold standard. And I think that those initial years of the Great Depression are just one of incredible flux that is the case. I think it's well known that is true in places like England, that goes off the gold standard, I believe, in September 1931, Japan in December 1931. But maybe perhaps not as, these kind of internal debates are not as well known in kind of the China case, which is actually perhaps considering going on the gold standard when the rest of the world is going off the gold standard. So I think that's kind of the narrative vehicle there. And kind of the way that chapter ends is that the nationalist government does kind of get rid of the different tail units of account, and the Shanghai Mint does open. But the coin it makes kind of reminds people of it's kind of a rising sun in the background with kind of birds overhead. And it reminds people of Japanese planes that had recently kind of bombed Shanghai. So it's again a story of kind of increased centralization by the nationalist government, but also still uncertainty and kind of unresolved debates about what type of monetary system to have and why.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that whole story then that we sort of see throughout the book in terms of, more centralization, I guess, greater role for the state, but also still the questions of how exactly are we going to figure out what currency China should actually have. I think all of that sort of culminates then in chapter 7 when you talk about the Fabi, of course, the new currency that's brought in 1935, and with the Fabi reform, then in the sense, as you I think very convincingly argue, that really brings to the end this sort of really important role that silver plays in the global economy, and China as well, of course. So. I guess just sort of as a start, it would be good if you could explain a bit what the Fabi actually is, because I think again people not familiar with China or Chinese history probably don't really know. And then what was the idea behind this reform, and in general, and how successful was it?
Right. So the Fabi is essentially going off of the silver standard in kind of the simplest explanation. And in November of 1935, the nationalist government starts to kind of promise to buy and sell dollars and pounds at kind of stated rates of exchange. And that's kind of the mechanism that is, in a sense, backing the new currency. And kind of the path to that is, again, heavily influenced by the Depression and also the United States, where there's a thread of argument in the United States that the reason the world is in a depression is that China is on the silver standard, what some American politicians call the loincloth standard of living, right? And that because China has so many people, but they aren't able to buy enough products, right? That global commerce has come to a halt. And that's a particularly, especially certain U.S. senators, especially one Key Pittman from Nevada, who's a very influential senator on the kind of Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This is his kind of theory of the Depression, right? That, well, the reason we're in a depression is because people in China, the purchasing power of their of silver, it just has continued to fall. And if we raise the price of silver, the people in China will start buying more stuff, and then the depression will be over, right? And he is arguing this in kind of 32, 33, and he becomes influential. And again, this is perhaps, we don't need to get too much into the internal politics of the United States at the time, but there is kind of this thing called the Silver Purchase Act of 1934. It's basically the U.S. pledging to buy silver on the world market at above market rates until it reaches a certain kind of price, or that it forms a certain percentage of like U.S. reserves, right? So it's basically a huge silver buying campaign. And a lot of people, observers in China, have said, this is not going to work out the way you think it will, and that there are many factors working in the global economy, and we shouldn't have a silver-focused interpretation of this economic crisis, in that it will kind of bring more harm to China than benefits, as silver might flow out of the country and cause a lot of hardships internally and lead to actually deflation. And that's more or less what happens. Again, trying to simplify over kind of summer, fall 1934, and then into 1935. And then the question becomes, for internally within the nationalist government, well, what to do and how to do it, right? And it's, in some ways, their hand is forced, and in some ways, all of these kind of debates and discussions that have been percolating for 30 years kind of culminate. And essentially what happens is that the nationalist government sends a representative to the United States to essentially say, well, buy our silver, give us dollars, and we will have this kind of new FAB, which the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, Secretary Morgenthau, there's this sense that, there's a sense in the United States that, well, this is the moment that the U.S. has been waiting for, right? I think, again, there was kind of an overly optimistic reading of the situation, but essentially that a lot of people in China doubt that the government is going to be able to do anything. They essentially doubt the capacity of the nationalist government to pull it off, especially one figure I focus on a lot, Ma Ying-chu, who is kind of one of the first generation of Chinese economists, and is actually a member of the Kuomintang party and a member of the government. Basically says that he doesn't think the government is capable of fixing this situation and that the government is screwed. And he's a high-ranking official, which is kind of interesting to hear. And I think kind of despite doubts within China and abroad, when you go back and read The Economist magazine from this period, they have their doubts. Kind of the government pulls it off. And the FAB is quite successful in kind of 35, 36 in terms of bringing price stability and also holding exchange value from, say, November 35, really even through the initial period of World War II into kind of, say, spring 1938 or so, when Japan will kind of establish like the Federated Bank of Northern China in kind of the kind of currency war aspect of World War II kind of really reaches its acute phase.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of always interesting to speculate what would have happened, of course, if 1937 you don't have the start of World War II in Asia, and how the FAB could have developed, because of course after the initial phase of the war, of course, it becomes very difficult for the nationalists to sort of maintain the currency. But as you say, I mean, even though people like mine who were skeptical, it actually, as you sort of explained very nicely in the book, it actually works out. In the beginning, at least before the outbreak of war, the FAB is actually quite successful. But I wonder whether you could talk, I mean, you also make, of course, a point in the chapter, but also in the book more generally, that this,